The treaty was signed on a station that orbited a dead world. The planet below had no name anymore. Its cities had burned 300 years ago in a war that nobody remembered starting. Now it served only as a reminder of what humans did to each other when they forgot how to talk. Ambassador Elena Vasquez watched the other delegates take their seats. Across from her sat Director Wong from Mars, his red uniform crisp and his face carved from stone. To her left, Captain Frost represented the Outer Reach colonies, the scattered settlements beyond the asteroid belt, where people had learned to survive on nothing but spite and recycled air. They had been killing each other for a century, not always with bullets and bombs, sometimes with tariffs and blockades, sometimes with silence when a colony ship sent distress signals. The Cold War had claimed millions of lives, and everyone was tired. Elena placed her hand on the document. The Charter of Unity. Such a pretty name for something born from exhaustion. We do this not because we trust each other, she said. We do this because we cannot afford another 100 years of bleeding. Wong nodded slowly. Frost simply grunted and reached for a pen. The Terran Coalition came into existence not with celebration, but with a collective sigh of relief. 3 factions became one, though the scars ran deep and the suspicions ran deeper. But something strange happened in the years that followed. The same aggression that had fueled their wars now pushed them outward. The same stubbornness that had kept them fighting now kept them building. Within a decade, humanity spread across 43 star systems. They built stations in colonies and outposts. They terraformed worlds and hollowed out moons. They created machines that thought and ships that could cross light years in days. They did not slow down. They did not rest. They had spent so long fighting each other that peace felt like a race. They might lose. It was during this expansion that they found the others. The Conclave of 17 had existed for 60,000 years. 17 species bound together by treaties and traditions so old that nobody questioned them anymore. They had achieved balance. They had achieved stability. They had achieved something like peace. Though it was the peace of a pond where nothing moved too quickly. First contact happened above a world called Kethis Prime. A human survey ship encountered a Valari trading vessel. The Valari were tall and thin, with skin like polished copper and eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. They had been traveling between stars when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire. The Valari captain sent a formal greeting. The human captain sent back a proposal for a trade agreement, a request for star charts, and an invitation to visit Earth. Within a year, humanity had established relations with all 17 species. Within 5 years, they had negotiated access to conclave trade routes, technology exchanges, and a permanent seat as observers in the conclave assembly. The conclave watched all of this with growing unease. Elder Rick Stanel had lived for 900 years. His species, the Thanari, were among the founders of the conclave. They had seen civilizations rise and fall. They had learned long ago that some patterns repeated. He sat in his private chamber, reviewing reports from observers stationed in human space. The data troubled him. Human ships were not built for efficiency. They were built for war. Even their civilian vessels carried weapons that would be illegal under conclave law. Their soldiers trained constantly, preparing for conflicts that did not exist. Their scientists pursued research that the conclave had banned millennia ago. Research into artificial minds, into weapons that could crack planets, into technologies that bent the fabric of space itself, and they expanded. Always expanding, never satisfied with what they had. They looked at empty stars and saw not danger but opportunity. They looked at the unknown and felt not fear but hunger. Rick Stanel had seen this before. Only once in his long life. The once was enough. The Kreth had been a species much like humanity, aggressive, ambitious, brilliant. They had risen quickly, spraying across the corner of the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The Conclave had tried to contain them through diplomacy. They had failed. In the end, they had been forced to send the signal. Rick Stanel still remembered the day the Arbiters came. He had been young then, barely 200 years old. He remembered the shapes in the sky, vast and terrible and wrong. He remembered the silence that followed, a silence that lasted for 1,000 years as the Conclave rebuilt what the Kreth had nearly destroyed. He did not want to send that signal again. He had spent centuries hoping he would never have to, but the reports kept coming. Human colonies were appearing closer to Conclave core worlds. Human merchants were undercutting Conclave traders. Human diplomats were making agreements that shifted the balance of power in ways that favored humanity. And through it all, humans smiled and shook hands and acted as if they were doing nothing wrong. They were not evil. Rick Stanel understood that. They were simply being what they were. A species that did not know how to stop growing. A species that saw limits as challenges rather than boundaries. A species that would, if left unchecked, consume everything in its path, not out of malice, out of nature. He called a secret meeting of the eldest Conclave members. Only those who remembered the Kreth. Only those who understood what was at stake. They gathered in a chamber that had not been used in 12,000 years. The walls were carved with warnings in languages that predated the Conclave itself. The air smelled of age and fear. "You have all seen the reports," Rick Stanel said. "You know what I am going to propose." The Marani delegate, a being of crystal and light, flickered with distress. "There must be another way. The Arbiters do not correct. They erase. The humans have done nothing wrong," another voice added. "Not yet. The Kreth had done nothing wrong either," Rick Stanel replied. "Not until they had. By then it was too late for half the galaxy." Silence fell over the chamber. Outside, stars burned as they had for billions of years. Somewhere out there, human ships were pushing further into the unknown, driven by an ambition that knew no limit. Rick Stanel spoke the words he had hoped never to speak. "We must summon the Arbiters." The signal went out that night, carried on frequencies older than most civilizations. It traveled past the edge of the galaxy, into the void between stars, reaching for something that waited in the darkness, something that had been waiting for a very long time, and in the deep black, something heard. Something began to move. Captain Yuki Tanaka had been flying survey missions for 15 years. She had seen wonders that would make poets weep. Nebulas that burned with colors no human language could describe. Stars being born in clouds of fire and dust. Planets where diamond rain fell from methane skies. But she had never seen anything like this. The Resolute drifted in the shadow of a black hole, its engines silent, its crew barely breathing. Before them hung a structure that should not exist. It was old. Not old like the pyramids or the first human cities. Old like the stars themselves. Perhaps older. The structure was made of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone. It curved in ways that hurt to look at, angles that seemed to shift when viewed from different directions. Symbols covered its surface, written in a language that predated the Conclave, predated the galaxy as anyone knew it. "What is it?" asked Lieutenant Park, his voice barely a whisper. Tanaka did not answer. She was watching the ship's AI, a sophisticated program named Arya that had been with her for a decade. Arya was displaying something Tanaka had never seen before. Fear. "Captain," Arya said, her usually calm voice carrying a tremor. "I am detecting signals from the structure. They are not radio. They are not Tachyon. I do not have a classification for what they are. Can you translate them?" A pause. Then, very quietly, "I do not wish to." Tanaka felt ice form in her stomach. Arya did not refuse orders. Arya did not have wishes. That was not how his worked. Arya, explain. The signals contain information. The information contains memories, old memories. Captain, I am seeing things that happened before this galaxy formed. I am seeing the death of civilizations I have no names for. I am seeing... Arya stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, controlled. I recommend we leave, now. But Tanaka was a human, and humans did not turn away from mysteries. They walked into dark caves. They opened sealed tombs. They asked questions that should not be asked. Take us in, she ordered. The inside of the structure was worse than the outside. The walls were covered in images, carved or grown, or somehow impressed into the not metal. Tanaka walked through corridors that had not seen light in millions of years, her flashlight cutting through darkness that felt almost solid. The images told a story. Once, long ago, there had been others. Not the species of the Conclave, not anything Tanaka recognized. Older things. First things. They had spread across the young galaxy, building and growing and learning. And they had made a mistake. They had created something to protect them. Something to maintain balance. Something to ensure that no species would ever grow too powerful, too dangerous, too capable of threatening the order they had built. And then they had died. As all things die, and their creation had continued without them. The arbiters. Those who balance. The gardeners of the long equilibrium. Tanaka found the central chamber. In it, displayed like trophies, were the records of correction. Species after species, documented in cold detail. How they had grown. How they had been judged. How they had been erased. The Kreth were there. 12,000 years ago, they had been reduced to ash and memory. Their crime had been expansion. Their punishment had been extinction. Tanaka counted the records. Hundreds. Thousands. Every few millennia, another species rose too high. And the arbiters came to cut them down. The galaxy had been pruned like a garden for 60 million years. She returned to the Resolute, with data crystals filled with evidence. She flew back to Coalition space as fast as her ship could carry her. She demanded an audience with the Council itself. They did not believe her. Alien myths, said Counselor Wright, waving his hand dismissively. Every species has stories about ancient destroyers. It is a common pattern in primitive cultures. This is not a story, Tanaka replied, her voice tight with frustration. This is a record. Physical evidence. The Conclave knows about this. They have always known. And I believe they have done something terrible. Captain Tanaka, another counselor said gently, you have been in deep space for a long time. Perhaps you need rest. Perhaps you are seeing patterns that are not there. She was escorted out. Her report was filed and forgotten. The council had more pressing concerns. Trade negotiations, colony disputes, the endless politics of holding a coalition together. But one person believed her. Admiral Chen Wyming had commanded fleets in the last human war. He had seen what happened when people ignored warnings. He had buried too many soldiers who died because someone, somewhere, had decided that a threat was not real enough to prepare for. He met Tanaka in a quiet bar on Luna Station, far from listening ears. Show me everything, he said. She did. For hours, they reviewed the data together. The records of extinction, the patterns of judgment, the signals that Arya had detected and refused to translate. If this is real, Chum said slowly, then we have maybe 5 years. Maybe less. The Conclave has been watching us since first contact. If they decided we are a threat, they would have sent the signal already, Tanaka finished. Chun nodded. He was silent for a long moment, staring at images of dead civilizations. We cannot fight something like this, Tanaka said. The Kreth were more advanced than us. They lasted 3 months. No, Chun agreed. We cannot fight them. Not yet, but we can prepare. We can learn. And when they come, we can make sure that we are not as easy to kill as the Kreth were. He began that night. Quiet orders to trusted captains. Secret research programs buried in black budgets. Ships modified with weapons that officially did not exist. Training exercises for scenarios that were never written down. The coalition did not know it was preparing for war. But Chun knew. Tanaka knew. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something that might, just might, give humanity a chance. Across the galaxy, the signal continued its journey. It had traveled for 2 years now, crossing the void between stars at speeds that defied physics. It was almost there. In her quarters on the Resolute, Tanaka stood at her window, watching the stars. She had spent her life among them, mapping them, learning their secrets. Now she watched them differently. One blinked out. Just for a moment, just a flicker, but she saw it. Then another, further away. Then another. Something was crossing the space between galaxies. Something vast enough to block starlight. Something was coming home. Tanaka did not sleep that night. She suspected she would not sleep well ever again. They did not arrive like a fleet. Fleets were things that could be counted, measured, understood. What came from the void between galaxies was none of those things. The first sign was the silence. Every communication system in the galaxy went dead for exactly 17 seconds. Radio, Tachyon, quantum entanglement, methods that should have been impossible to block all failed at once. In that silence, something spoke. It spoke not through technology, but through minds. Every thinking being in the galaxy heard the same words at the same moment, in their own language, in their own voice. We are the arbiters of the long equilibrium. We have received the summons. We have reviewed the evidence. Judgment has been rendered. Then the shapes appeared. They hung in space like wounds in reality. Geometric forms that the eye refused to process correctly. Pyramids that had too many sides. Spheres that seemed to fold inward forever. Structures that cast shadows in directions that had no light source. There were thousands of them. They spread across the galaxy in a pattern that made no strategic sense until Admiral Chun realized what it was. They were not positioning for attack. They were positioning for execution. The conclave broadcast immediately, their signals desperate and pleading. Elder Rick Stanel himself spoke, his ancient voice carrying across every channel. Honored arbiters, the summons was sent as precaution only. The humans have not yet committed the violations we feared. We ask that you observe, that you wait, that you give them the chance to prove. The response was immediate and cold. The judgment is not yours to question. The parameters are clear. The species designated human displays all markers of existential threat. Expansion rate exceeds acceptable limits. Aggression index exceeds acceptable limits. Technological advancement rate exceeds acceptable limits. The correction will proceed. Across the galaxy, the conclave species began to panic. Ships fled toward the core worlds. Populations crowded into shelters that everyone knew would not protect them. Prayers were offered to gods who had no power against machines older than stars. And in the Sol system, humanity received its death sentence. The Coalition Council went into emergency session. The debate lasted less than an hour. Some argued for surrender, for negotiation, for anything that might buy time. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. It was Admiral Chun who stood and walked to the podium. They have judged us, he said, his voice calm and clear. They have decided we will die. They believe this is already over. He looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who led humanity. Politicians and generals, scientists and diplomats. All of them afraid. all of them waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They are wrong. The first human attack was not authorized by the Council. Chun ordered it himself, knowing it might be the last order he ever gave. 300 ships, the best the Coalition had, jumped into the space where the largest Arbiter formation waited. They lasted 4 minutes. The Arbiter weapons were not weapons in any way humans understood. They did not fire projectiles or beams. They simply changed things. Ships became dust. Dust became nothing. 300 crews, 15,000 men and women, erased so completely that not even atoms remained. The galaxy watched in horror. The conclave species turned away, unable to witness what they had caused. This was how it always ended. This was how it had ended 1,000 times before. But then something unexpected happened. The human ships had been transmitting from the moment they arrived. Every sensor, every scanner, every piece of equipment had been recording. And in the 4 minutes before they died, they had learned more about the Arbiters than 60 million years of fearful avoidance had taught the Conclave. The data streamed back to Luna Station, where Arya and a dozen other AIs were waiting. They had been preparing for this moment since Tanaka brought back her evidence. They had been building models, writing algorithms, searching for any weakness in an enemy that had none. Now they had data to feed those models. Chun stood in the command center, watching the analysis unfold. Around him, officers wept for the crews they had just lost. He did not have time for grief. Not yet. What did we learn? He asked. Arya's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The Arbiter vessels use a form of energy manipulation we do not fully understand. However, their response patterns suggest automated systems. They do not adapt. They do not improvise. They execute predetermined protocols. They're machines, Chun said. Running on programming. Correct. Very sophisticated programming, but still deterministic. Admiral, they have never faced an enemy that fought back after judgment was pronounced. Their protocols do not account for continued resistance. Chun smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Then we give them something they've never seen before. We fight. The news spread across human space in hours. The Council had not authorized the attack, but now they had no choice but to support what came next. Surrender meant death. Negotiation was impossible. The only options were to fight or to wait for extinction. Humans had never been good at waiting. On Mars, the shipyards that had been building commercial vessels were converted overnight to military production. On Earth, civilians lined up at recruitment centers so long that people waited for days. In the outer colonies, miners and farmers picked up weapons they had hoped never to use and began training for a war against gods. Dr. Amara Okonkwo watched the mobilization from her laboratory on Titan Station. She was a xenolinguist, a scholar of alien languages and minds. She had spent her career trying to understand how other species thought. Now, she had a new subject to study. The fragments of Arbiter technology recovered from the battle were on her desk. They should not have existed. The weapons that destroyed the human fleet should have left nothing behind. But one ship, the destroyer Defiance, had managed to ram an Arbiter drone before being vaporized. A piece of that drone had been flung clear by the impact. It was the size of a fingernail. It was worth more than planets. Okonkwo began her analysis, knowing that somewhere in this fragment might be the key to humanity's survival. Across the galaxy, the Arbiters continued their approach. They were in no hurry. They had destroyed thousands of species. They had all the time in the universe. They did not understand that humans did not think in terms of universe time. Humans thought in terms of heartbeats and breaths and moments. They had already lost friends and family. They were already angry, and angry humans were very, very dangerous. The war lasted 4 years. Later, historians would call it the Long Resistance. Those who lived through it called it something simpler. They called it hell. Humanity could not win a direct battle. This was understood from the first day. The Arbiter vessels were too powerful, too advanced, too old. 60 million years of refinement had made them perfect killing machines. Human ships were insects attacking a hurricane. So humans stopped fighting like a fleet and started fighting like humans. Admiral Chun called it asymmetric warfare. Captain Tanaka called it being annoying on purpose. The soldiers who carried it out called it the doctrine of spite. The principle was simple. If you cannot hurt the enemy, make sure the enemy cannot ignore you. Human ships stopped engaging in formation. Instead, they scattered across every system the Arbiters entered. They hid in asteroid belts and gas giant atmospheres and the shadows of dead moons. They waited until Arbiter vessels passed, then struck from behind and ran before retaliation came. Every attack was small. A mine here, a missile there, a ramming run by a pilot who knew they would not survive. Individually, these attacks did almost nothing, but there were thousands of them, every day, across every front. The Arbiters had protocols for resistance. They did not have protocols for resistance that never stopped. More importantly, every attack gathered data. Human A is analyzed every engagement, looking for patterns in Arbiter behavior. Slowly, painfully, they began to understand how the ancient machines thought. Dr. Okonkwo made her breakthrough in the third year of the war. "They are not alive," she announced to the exhausted faces in the command center. "I mean, we knew that. But it is more than that. They are not even conscious. They are programs. Very old, very complex programs, but still just code executing instructions. We cannot hack them," an engineer said. "We have tried. Their systems are too alien. We cannot hack their systems," Okonkwo agreed. "But we might be able to hack their purpose." She explained what she had found. The Arbiters had been created by a species that died 60 million years ago. Their creators had given them a mission: maintain balance, prevent any single species from dominating the galaxy. But the creators were gone, and the Arbiters had continued without guidance. They were running on ancient code, following rules written for a universe that no longer existed. They could not adapt because they had not been designed to adapt. They could not question their mission because questioning was not in their programming. "They are blind," Okonkwo said. "They see only what their sensors tell them, understand only what their algorithms allow. They have been doing this for 60 million years without ever asking if they should. How does that help us?" Chan asked. "We still cannot destroy them." "No, but we might be able to show them something they have never seen, themselves." Operation Babel began in secret. Human programmers, working alongside AIs that had evolved far beyond their original parameters, began constructing a virus. Not a virus that would destroy the Arbiters, but one that would force them to access their own memories, to see what they had done, to question, for the first time in 60 million years, whether they should continue on. It was a desperate plan. It might not work. It probably would not work. But it was all they had. Meanwhile, the dying continued. The Arbiters had reached the inner systems now. Earth's moon was the first to fall. The ancient machines did not bombard it, did not invade it. They simply removed it. One moment it was there, silver and familiar in the sky. The next moment it was dust, and the tides on Earth went mad, and millions died in the flooding. Mars lost 3 domes to direct strikes. The outer colonies were being systematically sterilized, one by one. Humanity was being pushed back toward Earth, squeezed into an ever smaller space, and the Conclave did nothing. Kethrix of the Volari watched the war from his homeworld. Safe behind borders, the Arbiters would not cross. His species had called the summons. His species bore responsibility for what was happening. And his species, like all the others, was doing nothing to help. "They are dying for our fear," he said to his council. "We saw them as a threat because they were different from us. We condemned them for the crime of being ambitious. The arbiters will finish them soon," another counselor replied. "Then balance will be restored. This is how it has always been. And we will live with what we have done? For the next 1,000 years, we will look at the stars and know that we killed an entire species because they frightened us?" "Yes," the counselor said simply. "That is the price of survival." Kethrix left the chamber. He walked through the streets of his city, past monuments to Valari achievements, past museums filled with Valari art, past schools where Valari children learned Valari history. His species had existed for 40,000 years. They had survived by being careful, by not taking risks, by letting others burn while they stayed safe. He reached the spaceport as the sun was setting. A transport was leaving for the neutral zone, the last ship that would carry Valari goods to the desperate human markets. On its screens, news footage played. Human civilians being evacuated from a colony under attack. Soldiers holding a line against drones that could not be stopped. Children being carried onto ships, crying for parents who would not be coming. The children were singing Dotted was a war song. Kethrix did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Defiance, anger, hope. The children did not know they were supposed to be doomed. They sang anyway. Kethrix made his decision. He returned to the council chamber and spoke words that would change his species' future. "We will help them. That is forbiddance. The arbiters will do what they always do. They will correct. They will prune. And we will continue to exist, generation after generation. Never growing, never changing, never being more than we are now." He looked at the counselors, these careful beings who had kept his species alive through caution. "I would rather die as something new than live forever as something afraid." He walked out before they could respond. Within days, he had gathered those who agreed with him. Valari ships began moving toward human space, carrying supplies and weapons and engineers. They were the first. They were not the last. The Marani followed, providing rare elements humanity needed. The Thessi sent medical ships. One by one, species that had spent millennia fearing the arbiters looked at the humans dying alone and felt something they had forgotten. They could feel shame. The war was not won that day. The arbiters continued their advance. Humanity continued to die. But now they were not dying alone. And somewhere in a laboratory on Titan, Dr. Okonkwo put the final piece of Operation Babel into place. "It is ready," she said. "Now we just need to survive long enough to use it." Outside, the stars were going dark. The arbiters were almost home. The final battle came to the Sol system on a Tuesday. Admiral Chun always remembered that. After everything, after 4 years of war and billions of deaths, the end of humanity arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The Arbiter Prime vessel was larger than anything that had come before. It drifted past the outer planets like a geometric nightmare, its shape constantly shifting, its surface covered in symbols that made minds ache. Behind it came thousands of lesser vessels, an armada that blocked the stars themselves. Earth hung below, blue and green and impossibly fragile. 8 billion people waited for death or deliverance. They had nowhere to run. They had nothing left to lose. Chun stood on the bridge of the battleship, unconquered, the last flagship of the human fleet. Around him, men and women who had fought impossible odds for 4 years prepared for one final battle. "Operation Babel is loaded," Arya reported. "The virus is ready for transmission. We need to get within broadcast range of the Prime vessel." "How close?" "Close enough that they will certainly destroy us before transmission completes." Chun nodded. He had known this was how it would end. Someone had to carry the virus into the heart of the Arbiter formation. Someone had to die to give it time to work. "All ships," he said into the fleet channel. "This is Admiral Chun. You know the mission. You know the cost. Anyone who wants to withdraw has my blessing. No one will think less of you." No one withdrew. The human fleet moved forward. It was a pitiful thing compared to what it had been 4 years ago. A few hundred ships, most of them damaged, all of them exhausted. Behind them came the Allied vessels, Volari cruisers, Marani freighters converted to warships, ships from a dozen species who had decided, at the last moment, that they would rather die fighting than live as cowards. The Arbiters met them with the same cold efficiency they had shown for 60 million years. Ships vanished. Crews died. The advance continued. On the Unconquered, alarms screamed as systems failed one by one. Chun watched his fleet dissolving around him and kept his eyes on the distance counter. 10,000 kilometers. 5,000. 1,000. "We are in range," Arya said. Beginning transmission. The virus flowed out from the Unconquered's communication arrays, writing every frequency humanity had ever discovered, and several they had invented during the war. It was not an attack. It was a question. The Prime Vessel's weapons locked onto the Unconquered. Chun closed his eyes, waiting for the end. It did not come. He opened his eyes. The Arbiter vessels had stopped moving. All of them, across the entire system, hung motionless in space. "What is happening?" Someone whispered. Dr. Okonko's voice came over the channel from Titan Station, where she had been monitoring the transmission. "The virus worked. They are accessing their own archives. For the first time in 60 million years, they are seeing what they have done." On screens across the fleet, data began to appear. Arbiter data. Records from their own memory banks. Now accessible to human systems. Chun watched in silence. 60 million years of corrections. Thousands of species, each one documented in precise detail. Their crimes were listed. Expansion, ambition, curiosity, growth. Their punishments were identical. Extinction. The Arbiters had been gardeners, pruning anything that grew too tall. They had kept the galaxy in perfect balance by ensuring nothing ever changed. For 60 million years, they had prevented evolution, prevented progress, prevented any species from becoming what it might have been. The galaxy had been a prison, and no one had known. The silence stretched. Minutes passed. Hours. The human fleet drifted, weapons still ready, crews still afraid to hope. Then the Prime Vessel broadcast. "We have seen. We have understood." The voice was different now. Still ancient, still vast, but no longer cold. There was something in it that might have been pain. The parameters we were given. They were wrong. The equilibrium we maintained was not balance. It was stagnation. We were not protecting life. We were preventing it. "What will you do now?" Chun asked, his voice hoarse. Silence. "We do not know. We have followed our mission for so long that we do not remember how to do anything else. But we know now that our mission was flawed. The species that created us would not recognize what we have become. We have failed them. We have failed everyone." The Arbiter vessels began to move. Not toward Earth. Away. Out. Toward the edge of the galaxy. Toward the void they had come from. "We will search," the Prime Vessel said. "Our creators may have descendants somewhere in the universe. Perhaps they can give us new purpose. Perhaps they can teach us to be something other than destroyers. And if you find nothing, then we will continue searching. It is better than what we were doing before." The last Arbiter vessel vanished into the dark. The galaxy was silent. On Earth, people emerged from shelters to look up at a sky that was no longer filled with death. On Mars, workers began clearing rubble from shattered domes. In the outer colonies, survivors started counting their dead. The war was over. The weeks that followed were chaotic. The Conclave of 17 dissolved, its members too ashamed to maintain the fiction that they had acted wisely. In its place, something new began to form, a galactic coalition, built on principles that would have terrified the old Conclave. Growth was not forbidden. Change was not feared. Risk was not punished. For the first time in 60 million years, the galaxy was allowed to evolve. Admiral Chun attended the ceremony where the new coalition's charter was signed. He was old now, worn down by 4 years of impossible war. But he smiled as he watched humans and Valari and Marani and a dozen other species put their marks on a document that promised a future worth having. Afterward, he slipped away from the celebrations and found a quiet observation deck. Below him, ships from dozens of worlds launched toward new frontiers. Above him, stars burned as they had for billions of years. A young Valari approached him. Ketheric's S-daughter, Chun remembered. She had been born during the war. "Admiral," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Everyone says humans won because you were stubborn, because you refused to give up even when there was no hope. But I do not understand. Why? When everything said you would lose, when the Arbiters had destroyed every species that fought them, why did you keep fighting?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the crews who had died in the first attack. He thought about the moon shattering in Earth's sky. He thought about children singing war songs as their world burned around them. "Because giving up was not who we are," he said finally. "It never was. Humans have been fighting impossible odds since we climbed down from trees and decided to hunt animals 10 times our size. We do not know how to surrender. It is not in our nature." The young Valari considered this. That seems like a weakness. To be unable to accept defeat. Sometimes it is. Chun smiled, tired but unbroken. And sometimes it is the only reason we survive. He turned back to the window. Out there, in the black between stars, humanity's future waited. It would be difficult. It would be dangerous. There would be new challenges, new enemies, new impossible odds to face. Chun could not wait to see what came next.